was absolutely unbelievable to everyone, but she just had that premonition. It didn't really convey as much to us as it did to my parents, obviously.
The Titanic sank in 1912, but survivors drowned in guilt for decades after. One survivor, who first spotted the iceberg, took his own life 53 years later. A little girl couldn't sleep without screaming for years. An actress filmed a movie about the disaster wearing the same clothes she escaped in, then had a breakdown. Some survivors became famous. Others were treated like villains just for living. Their bodies escaped the freezing Atlantic, but their minds remained trapped there forever. This is a harrowing story you never saw in the Titanic movie. On the freezing night of April 14th, 1912, the Titanic cut through the dark Atlantic under a sky full of stars. Just before midnight, a lookout saw something huge in the water and rang the warning bell. It was an iceberg. On the bridge, officers tried to steer the ship away and ordered full reverse, but it was too late. At exactly 11:40 p.m., the so-called unsinkable ship scraped along the side of the iceberg. It didn't feel violent, just a strange shake, like a jar, but it tore open the ship below the waterline. Cold seawater began pouring in almost right away. At first, no one thought much of it. The engines stopped, but passengers were calm. Many were in bed or still enjoying their evening. Some were reading, some were playing cards, and the band kept playing cheerful music. Molly Brown, a wealthy first-class passenger, was knocked to the floor by the jolt, but didn't panic. Others were curious, even joking. Men in silk pajamas asked if each other could swim. Stewards said everything was fine, but far below, the truth was already terrifying. 5 of Titanic's watertight compartments were flooding. Captain Edward Smith soon realized the ship wouldn't survive. That's when things began to change. The crew started waking passengers and handed out life jackets. The lifeboats were uncovered, but Titanic had only 20 of them, far too few for over 2,200 people on board. This fact alone would turn a disaster into a tragedy. In second class, a little girl named Ava Hart and her parents felt the jolt and got dressed immediately. Her mother had a bad feeling and insisted they head to the deck. In third class, things were worse. Many didn't speak English and were trapped in a maze of lower corridors. Some never made it out. Around 12:15 a.m., the crew began firing flares into the sky. They had spotted another ship in the distance, but it never responded. Some believe it was the SS Californian, which may have seen the flares but didn't react. Meanwhile, Titanic's wireless operators tapped out desperate messages to nearby ships using CQD and SOS. Down in the mailroom, workers tried to save the mail bags as water reached their knees. Deep in the engine rooms, men stayed behind to keep the lights and power running. They knew they wouldn't survive, but they kept working anyway. Back on deck, many still didn't understand how bad things were. The ship looked solid. It wasn't leaning, and the lights were still on. Some women didn't want to leave. They clung to their husbands, refusing to get into the small wooden lifeboat swinging above the dark sea. Others stepped in slowly. A young stewardess named Violet Jessup watched as officers gently pushed women toward the boats. Some men stepped back without protest. They knew they weren't going. The call of women and children first was being followed, though not always perfectly. The first lifeboat was lowered at 12:30 a.m. It could carry 65 people, but only 28 were inside. Many early boats were sent off half full. It was quiet. There was no screaming, no rush, just uncertainty. One man, Lawrence Beasley, sat in a lifeboat watching the Titanic drift in the distance. Everything was still. Nobody spoke. The ship looked beautiful under the stars, even as it slowly began to sink. But soon, the silence turned to tension. Second Officer Charles Lightoller ran the port side lifeboats and strictly refused to let any men board. One man tried to sneak in. Lightoller pointed a gun at him. It wasn't loaded, but the message was clear. Across the ship, First Officer Murdoch allowed some men on board if there were no women waiting, so more of his boats were filled. One of those men was J. Bruce Ismay, the boss of the company that owned Titanic. He had helped load several boats, but when Boat C was about to leave half empty, he quietly stepped in. He didn't speak. He didn't look back. People would judge him harshly later, but in that moment, moment, he just sat, staring at the ship as it began to die behind him. On the decks, men helped women climb up ladders. Some fathers kissed their wives and children goodbye, knowing they'd never see them again. Meanwhile, the crew was trying to get 2 more lifeboats ready, canvas ones, collapsible, and barely seaworthy. These boats were stored on top of the officers' quarters and had to be assembled by hand. It was already past 2 a.m. Water was pouring onto the deck as crew members struggled with the ropes. Officer Lightoller and others had just freed one of them when the ship suddenly tilted harder. Inside the ship, dishes and furniture came crashing down. Outside, the deck was now steep and dangerous. 17-year-old Jack Thayer stood near the stern with his friend Milton Long. All the boats were gone. There was no choice left. The 2 young men looked at each other, said nothing, and jumped. Jack later wrote that neither of them expected to survive. They simply dove into the freezing Black Sea. A few minutes later, around 2:18 a.m., the Titanic's front end slipped beneath the waves. Her rear end lifted high into the air. The strain was too much. The ship snapped in half. Survivors saw it happen with their own eyes, even though British officials would later claim she went down in one piece. The lights, which had somehow stayed on this whole time, finally went out, and in the chaos, Chief Baker Charles Jogan stood on the very back of the ship. He'd been drinking whiskey and throwing deck chairs into the sea to help people float. As the ship tipped straight up, he held onto the railing and rode it down like an elevator. When the ship finally hit the water, it wasn't just cold, it was deadly. Officer Lightoller said it felt like being stabbed by 1,000 knives. The ocean was just 28 degrees, well below freezing. Hundreds of people, including Jack Thayer, were now floating in that water. They had life jackets, but it didn't matter. In minutes, the cold would stop their hearts. By 2:20 a.m., the Titanic was gone. The ocean swallowed her whole. Those in the lifeboats watched from a distance, too shocked to speak. Lawrence Beasley, sitting in Lifeboat 13, said they watched in complete silence. Then came a sound no one could forget, the screams. Hundreds of voices crying out at once. From Lifeboat 14, young Ava Hart heard it all. She said the worst part wasn't seeing the ship go down, it was hearing those screams. They didn't stop. For over an hour, the cries echoed across the sea. Colonel Gracie remembered the haunting sound, "My God, my God," repeated again and again, growing weaker until they vanished. Then came silence. A silence so complete, so cold, it didn't seem real. Ava Hart would never forget that moment. She said it felt like time had stopped. The stars were still shining above, but below, everything was gone. The Titanic was gone, and with it, over 1,000 souls, lost in the dark, silent sea. The lifeboats drifted in silence, rocking gently on the freezing Atlantic as the night dragged on. Around 700 people had made it off the Titanic and into 18 small boats. But survival didn't mean safety. The sea around them was scattered with chunks of ice and the floating bodies of those who hadn't made it. Some lifeboats were nearly empty. Others were packed with people sitting shoulder to shoulder. Most were in nightgowns or thin coats, their teeth chattering, hands numb, eyes wide with shock. All they could do was wait for rescue or for the cold to finish what the sinking had started. In Lifeboat 6, the situation was tense. The only crewman on board, Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, was falling apart. He wasn't giving orders, he was spreading fear. As the boat drifted away from the Titanic, they heard gunshots echo across the water. Some said it was officers firing in the air to control crowds. Then came a deep roar. Hitchens insisted it was the Titanic's boilers exploding. He was convinced the ship would pull everything nearby down with it. "We're doomed either way," he kept saying. The women around him sat in silence, staring into the black water, too afraid to speak. But one woman wouldn't sit still. Margaret Brown, who would later be known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, had had enough. Hitchens was ranting and refusing to go back to help the people still screaming in the water. Brown grabbed an oar. Another woman joined her. They didn't ask, they acted. With only one man in the boat and about 14 women, I knew someone had to start rowing, Brown later wrote. She tried to lead the group, even suggesting they return to search for survivors. But Hitchens snapped back that they'd only find stiffs. A bitter argument followed. Brown stood her ground, but in the end, the boat never turned back. That choice weighed heavily on her. She had fought to help, but the moment had passed. Still, the way she calmed the others, challenged Hitchens, and took control when everyone else froze, that became her legacy. Molly Brown never claimed to be a hero, but in that long, bitter night when courage was in short supply, she was one of the few who found it. Only one lifeboat came back to look for people in the water. It was Boat 14, led by 5th Officer Harold Lowe. He waited until the screams had quieted down. If he rushed in too soon, the boat could have been swamped by desperate people. When it seemed safe, he moved some passengers into nearby boats so he could return with space to help others. In that freezing darkness, Lowe and his small crew paddled back toward the wreck. They managed to pull a few people out of the icy water. Just 4 or 5 survived. One of them was a young Chinese man named Fang Lang. He was found clinging to a piece of wood, nearly frozen. He was one of at least 6 Chinese passengers who survived, though their stories were forgotten for decades. Not far away, 2 collapsible lifeboats were still floating, both barely holding together. One of them, called Collapsible B, had flipped over. Around 30 men were perched on top of its overturned canvas hull. Among them was Charles Littler, the highest-ranking officer to survive, and wireless operator Harold Bride. They stood for hours in ankle-deep water, helping each other stay balanced in the dark. One man didn't make it. Bride later noticed a body next to him. It was his colleague Jack Phillips, the ship's chief wireless operator. Phillips had stayed behind until the very end, sending SOS messages to try and get help. He died from the cold. Bride later said quietly, "He stood his ground until the crisis passed and then collapsed." The other collapsible boat, known as Boat A, was partially flooded. A few men and a third-class passenger named Kate Gilnog managed to climb aboard. By sunrise, only 12 people were still alive. The others had frozen during the night. The sea was silent and black. The lifeboats had drifted apart. People later said they felt like they were floating alone in an endless ocean, just small dots surrounded by darkness. Some lifeboats had lanterns, thanks to Captain Smith's earlier orders. Around 3:30 a.m., someone spotted a faint light far away on the horizon. Rescue was coming. By 4 a.m., the RMS Carpathia finally arrived. It had raced through the night at full speed, pushing its engines to the limit. In Lifeboat 2, Lookout Frederick Fleet, the man who had first seen the iceberg, was one of the first to notice a glow in the distance. He shouted in relief. As the Carpathia came closer, its lights looked like a miracle. After hours of cold, fear, and waiting in the dark, help had finally arrived. Through the icy waters, Carpathia weaved slowly, collecting lifeboats scattered over several miles. It took over 4 hours. As each lifeboat came alongside, crew and even passengers helped pull the weak and frozen survivors aboard. Some had to be lifted in slings. Many couldn't even speak. They just stared or cried. Mothers clutched their children. Children cried for lost parents. Some people were so cold and exhausted they collapsed the moment they stepped on deck. Blankets were handed out. Hot drinks followed. Survivors huddled close, some shaking from the cold, others from shock. Harold Bride, one of Titanic's wireless operators, had frostbitten feet and had to be carried to the ship's hospital. But somehow, despite the pain, he returned to work and helped Carpathia's wireless operator send out urgent messages. Others were less lucky. Archibald Gracie, a first-class passenger, was so drained that he never recovered. He died just 8 months later from the toll that night had taken on his body. Heartbreaking moments played out across the decks. A 17-year-old boy named Jack Thayer searched for his parents. He had survived. His mother had too, but his father was gone. 2 tiny boys, aged 4 and 2, stood alone. No one came to claim them. Their father had put them on a lifeboat, saving their lives but losing his own. The boys spoke only French. A kind woman named Margaret Hayes, who spoke their language, took them in until their mother could be found. Meanwhile, Carpathia's passengers gave up their own cabins and donated whatever clothes they could. One woman, Molly Brown, didn't just help. She led. She organized a survivors committee, raised money for those who had lost everything, and even gave medals to the Carpathia crew. Bruce Ismay, the man from White Star Line, locked himself in a doctor's cabin. He was shattered, unable to stop crying. The man who had once been full of confidence now could barely speak as he sent a message to his company, reporting Titanic's loss. By 9 a.m., every lifeboat had been recovered. The sea around Titanic Titanic's resting place was quiet again, just floating wreckage and deadly ice. Captain Rostron held a short prayer service, then turned Carpathia toward New York. It would take another 58 hours to get there. He didn't stay behind to recover bodies. That grim job would fall to other ships. Carpathia carried 706 survivors. More than twice that number had died. On board, grief settled over everything. People sat in silence, staring at the sea. Some wept quietly. Others were still too stunned to speak. A little girl named Ava Hart later remembered how her mother sobbed and sobbed when she realized her husband was never coming back. Survivors couldn't sleep. Nightmares kept waking them, replaying every sound, every scream. When Carpathia finally reached New York on April 18th, rain poured down from a gray sky. As she passed the Statue of Liberty, the sight was almost too much for those who had dreamed of arriving in joy. Crowds had gathered at the docks. Reporters swarmed the ship. The lifeboats were the first to be removed, quiet, haunting symbols of the disaster. Then came the survivors. Some had to be carried off on stretchers. First and second class passengers were led away from the steerage survivors, separated once again by class. Red Cross volunteers and women's aid groups were waiting with warm clothes and food. The world wanted answers. Survivors were hounded by questions. Some didn't respond. Others tried, but their faces said more than their words ever could. When the Titanic sank, most believed the worst was over for those who made it out alive. But in truth, for many survivors, that freezing night was only the beginning of a much longer nightmare. They didn't just live with the memory of what happened. They had to live with how the world saw them afterward. Some were branded heroes, others were labeled cowards, and some carried guilt so heavy it followed them to their graves. J. Bruce Ismay, one of the most powerful men on the ship, survived, but the press never forgave him for it. He was accused of sneaking into a lifeboat while women and children drowned. Newspapers mocked him with cruel cartoons, and at the official inquiry, he was grilled as if he were on trial for murder. He swore no women were near when he boarded the last collapsible boat, but no one cared. The shame broke him. He quit his job, disappeared to the Irish countryside, and lived out the rest of his days in isolation, haunted by what people said, and perhaps by what he saw that night. Second Officer Charles Littler became a symbol of calm and duty. He helped load lifeboats and even survived by clinging to a collapsible raft. Outwardly, he was praised and even went on to serve in World War I and helped rescue soldiers at Dunkirk. But inside, he was never the same. As the highest-ranking officer to survive, he carried deep guilt. He left out key details in official investigations, like the fact that the ship had broken in half, because he wanted to protect the reputation of the crew and the company. Behind closed doors, he battled the sound of drowning voices in his dreams. For many men, survival itself was seen as a failure. Colonel Archibald Gracie, a respected military officer, made it through on a capsized lifeboat, but the weight of loss crushed him. He spent his final months writing about the disaster, desperate to get every detail right. He died just months later, sick and grief-stricken, with his last words reportedly replaying the sinking in his mind. Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon escaped in a nearly empty lifeboat. Only 12 people in a boat meant for 40. That fact alone sparked suspicion. Then came the rumors that Sir Cosmo had bribed the crew not to return for people in the water. He had given the men £5 each, he said, just to replace their lost belongings, but that didn't matter. The public turned on them. They were accused of valuing money over lives, and the press dubbed their escape the money boat. Though no wrongdoing was ever proven, their reputations were ruined. Lady Duff Gordon once said she was blamed simply for saving herself. Not all survivors had public names or fortunes to defend. Most were immigrants in third class, heading for new lives in America. Many lost everything: families, clothes, money. The White Star Line gave them barely anything in return. Charity funds helped some, but the pain ran far deeper than material loss. In 1912, no one spoke of therapy or trauma. Survivors were expected to move move on, but they didn't. Ava Hart was just 7 when she boarded the Titanic with her parents. She survived with her mother, but her father was lost. For years, Ava couldn't sleep without screaming. She was haunted by the sounds of that night. She avoided the ocean altogether until her 20s, when she forced herself to take a ship voyage to face her fear. Only then did the nightmares begin to fade. She later spoke out against the arrogance that led to the disaster. The greatest tragedy, she said, was sailing with lifeboats for only 800 people, while there were over 2,200 on board. Some survivors never healed. Quartermaster Robert Hitchens helped row a lifeboat, but his angry behavior during the rescue earned him a bad reputation. He clashed with passengers and later grew bitter over how he was remembered. The Titanic followed him like a shadow. In the 1930s, he was jailed after an attempted murder and died in poverty, still carrying the weight of that cold April night. Then there was Frederick Fleet, the lookout who first spotted the iceberg. He rang the warning bell that should have saved them all, but it was too late. He survived, went back to sea, fought in the war, and ended up selling newspapers to get by. After his wife died and he lost his home, something inside him gave way. In 1965, he took his own life in a quiet garden. He was 77. Some say he was never able to forgive himself for seeing the iceberg too late, even though the real fault wasn't his. Margaret Brown was one of those people who refused to be defined by disaster. She could have milked the fame, but she chose to serve. She helped rebuild war-torn France, cared for wounded soldiers, and even ran for the United States Senate. People would later call her the unsinkable Molly Brown, but that wasn't her doing. She didn't chase the spotlight. After the Titanic, all she wrote to her daughter was, "I am sick at heart, but alive and safe." That's the kind of woman she was, grieving deeply, but still standing. Then there was Violet Jessop. Her story sounds like something out of a novel, only it was real. She survived not one, not two, but 3 major ship disasters. First on the Olympic when it collided with another ship. Then on the Titanic, where she was pushed into Lifeboat 16. And finally on the Britannic, which sank after hitting a mine during the war. She jumped overboard, was sucked underwater, hit her head on the keel, and still managed to survive. Later in life, doctors found an old skull fracture, the only souvenir she kept from her brush with death. After all that, she didn't quit. She went right back to working on ships. People called her Miss Unsinkable. She died at 84, living proof that some people are just built differently. Dorothy Gibson tried to turn her pain into art. She was a young actress when she survived the sinking. Just weeks later, she filmed a movie about it and wore the same clothes she'd escaped in. But pretending to relive the trauma broke her. She had a nervous breakdown and walked away from the spotlight for good. Later, she found herself imprisoned in Italy during World War II. She survived again, but her story always carried that shadow from Titanic like a scar that never healed. Not every survivor was celebrated. Masabumi Hosono, the only Japanese passenger, barely made it onto a lifeboat. He almost didn't. Crew tried to block him, steering him back below deck. He was ready to die. But then he saw an officer shout that 2 spots were left. One man jumped. Hosono hesitated, then followed. He later wrote that he couldn't bear the thought of never seeing his wife and children again. But Japan didn't see it that way. Newspapers called him a coward. He lost his job, was shunned by society, and even at home, Titanic was never spoken of again. It wasn't until the 1990s, when his letters were finally made public, that people began to understand. He hadn't hidden or cheated. He'd rowed the lifeboat, helped others, but the shame had already done its damage. He survived, but in many ways, he was never allowed to live. Even less known were the 6 Chinese men who made it out alive. They weren't tourists or rich passengers. They were workers heading to Cuba. One made it into a lifeboat. Others clung to wreckage. They were rescued, but not welcomed. The Chinese Exclusion Act made sure of that. They were deported immediately, their stories erased. Worse, newspapers accused them of disguising themselves as women or hiding. False, racist claims that stuck for years. None of them stole places. None of them cheated, but they paid the price anyway. They spent the rest of their lives drifting, country to country, job to job, never quite allowed to settle. Only now are their names being remembered. But for some, surviving meant fighting for others. Elsie Bowerman was only 22 when she escaped in the same lifeboat as Molly Brown. But she didn't fade into the background. She became a nurse in World War I, witnessed the Russian Revolution firsthand, and then became one of Britain's first female lawyers. Later, she helped helped shape the United Nations' work on women's rights. Her survival wasn't just a twist of fate, it became a mission. Then there were the children. The Navratil brothers had been traveling under false names, taken by their father during a custody dispute. He died in the sinking, but the boys lived and were eventually reunited with their mother. Michel, the older, became a professor and lived until 2001. He spent his life carrying the memory of being a Titanic orphan. Lillian Asplund was just 5 years old. She lost her father and 3 brothers. She survived with her mother and another brother, but stayed mostly silent for the rest of her life. She passed away in 2006, one of the last links to that night. And then there was Milvina Dean, the youngest of them all at just 9 weeks old. She never remembered the sinking, but she became a symbol. In her later years, she spoke at memorials and even sold her Titanic items to cover nursing home bills. James Cameron and Leonardo DiCaprio donated money to help her. She passed in 2009, closing the final chapter on living Titanic survivors. What connects all these people isn't just that they lived, it's how they carried what came after. Some found purpose, others carried pain. A few were punished for surviving at all, but each of their lives became a second story, a quieter one, of endurance, loss, and what it really means to keep going when the worst has already happened.